Section 26 of Celtic Folk and Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celtic Folk and Fairy Tales, edited by Joseph Jacobs. Section 26. The Lad with the Goat Skin. Long ago a poor widow woman lived down near the iron forge by Enniscorth, and she was so poor she had no clothes to put on her son. So she used to fix him in the ash hole near the fire, and pile the warm ashes about him. And according as he grew up, she sunk the pit deeper. At last, by hook or by crook, she got a goat skin and fastened it round his waist, and he felt quite grand, and took a walk down the street. So says she to him next morning, "Tom, you thief, you never done any good yet, and you 6 foot high and past 19. Take that rope and bring me a faggot from the wood." "Never say twice, mother," says Tom. "Here goes." When he had gathered it and tied it, what should come up but a big giant 9 foot high, and made a lick of a club at him. Well became Tom. He jumped to one side and picked up a ram pike, and the first crack he gave the big fellow, he made him kiss the clod. "If you e'er a prayer," says Tom, "now's the time to say it, before I make fragments of you." "I have no prayers," says the giant, "but if you spare my life I'll give you that club, and as long as you keep from sin you'll win every battle you ever fight with it." Tom made no bones about letting him off, and as soon as he got the club in his hands he sat down on the bresna and gave it a tap with the kippeen, and says, "Faggot, I had great trouble gathering you, and run the risk of my life for you. The least you can do is to carry me home." And sure enough, the wind of the word was all it wanted. It went off through the wood, groaning and crackling, till it came to the widow's door. Well, when the sticks were all burned, Tom was sent off again to pick more, and this time he had to fight with the giant that had 2 heads on him. Tom had a little more trouble with him, that's all, and the prayers he said was to give Tom a fife, that nobody could help dancing when he was playing it. But gories, he made the big faggot dance home with himself sitting on it. The next giant was a beautiful boy with 3 heads on him. He had neither prayers nor catechism, no more than the others. And so he gave Tom a bottle of green ointment that wouldn't let you be burned, nor scalded, nor wounded. "And now," he says, "there's no more of us. You may come and gather sticks here till Little Lunacy Day and harvest, without giant or fairyman to disturb you." Well, now Tom was prouder nor 10 paycock, and used to take a walk down street in the heel of the evening. But some of the little boys had no more manners than if they were Dublin jackeens, and put out their tongues at Tom's club and Tom's goat skin. He didn't like that at all, and it would be mean to give one of them a clout. At last, what should come through the town but a kind of a bellman, only it's a big bugle he had, and a huntsman's cap on his head, and a kind of painted shirt. So this, he wasn't a bellman, and I don't know what to call him. Bugleman, maybe, proclaimed that the King of Dublin's daughter was so melancholy that she didn't give a laugh for 7 years, and that her father would grant her in marriage to whoever could make her laugh 3 times. "That's the very thing for me to try," says Tom. And so, without burning any more daylight, he kissed his mother, curled his club at the little boys, and off he set along the yellow high road to the town of Dublin. At last Tom came to one of the city gates, and the guards laughed and cursed at him instead of letting him in. Tom stood it all for a little time, but at last one of them, out of fun, as he said, drove his bayonet half an inch or so into his side. Tom done nothing but take the fellow by the scruff of the neck and the waistband of his corduroys, and fling him into the canal. Some run to pull the fellow out, but others to let manners into the vulgarian with their swords and daggers. But a tap from his club sent them headlong into the moat or down on the stones, and they were soon begging him to stay his hands. So at last one of them was glad enough to show Tom the way to the palace yard, and there was the king and the queen and the princess in a gallery, looking at all sorts of wrestling and sword playing and long dances and mumming, all to please the princess. But not a smile came over her handsome face. Well, they all stopped when they seen the young giant, with his boy's face and long black hair, and his short curly beard, for his mother couldn't afford to buy razors, and his strong great arms and bare legs, and no covering but the goat skin that reached from his waist to his knees, but an envious, wizened bit of a fellow with a red head that wished to be married to the princess, and didn't like how she opened her eyes at Tom, came forward and asked his business very snappishly. "My business," said Tom, says he, "is to make the beautiful princess, God bless her, laugh 3 times." "Do you see all them merry fellows and skilful swordsmen," said the other, "that could eat you up with a grain of salt, and not a mother of soul ever got a laugh from her in these 7 years?" So the fellows gathered around Tom, and the bad man aggravated him till he told them that he didn't care a pinch of snuff for the whole bilin' of 'em. Let 'em come on 6 at a time and try what they could do. The king, who was too far off to hear what they were saying, asked what did the stranger want. "He wants," said the red-headed fellow, "to make hares of your best men." "Oh," says the king, "if that's the way, let one of 'em turn out and try his mettle." So one stood forward with sword and pot lid, and made a cut at Tom. He struck the fellow's elbow with the club, and up over their heads flew the sword, and down went the owner of it on the gravel from a thump he got on the helmet. Another took his place, and another, and another, and then half a dozen at once, and Tom sent swords, helmets, shields, and bodies rolling over and over, and themselves bawling out that they were to be kilt and disabled and damaged, and rubbing their poor elbows and hips and limping away. Tom contrived not to kill any one, and the princess was so amused that she let a great sweet laugh out of her that was heard all over the yard. "King of Dublin," said Tom, "I've quarter of your daughter." And the king didn't know whether he was glad or sorry, and all the blood in the princess's heart run into her cheeks. So there was no more fighting that day, and Tom was invited to dine with the royal family. Next day Redhead told Tom of a wolf the size of a yearling heifer that used to be serenading about the walls and eating people and cattle, and said what a pleasure it would give the king to have it killed. "With all my heart," says Tom. "Send a jackeen to show me where he lives, and we'll see how he behaves to a stranger." The princess was not well pleased, for Tom looked a different person with fine clothes, and a nice green burda over his long curly hair, and besides he'd got one laugh out of her. However, the king gave his consent, and in an hour and a half the horrible wolf was walking into the palace yard, and Tom a step or 2 behind, with his club on his shoulder, just as a shepherd would be walking after a pet lamb. The king and queen and princess were safe up in their gallery, but the officers and people of the court that were patrolling about the great bawn, when they saw the big baste coming in, gave themselves up and began to make for doors and gates. And the wolf licked his chops, as if he was saying, "Wouldn't I enjoy a breakfast of a couple of yez?" The king shouted out, "O Tom with the goat skin, take away that terrible wolf, and you must have all my daughter." But Tom didn't mind him a bit. He pulled out his flute and began to play like vengeance, and dickens a man or boy in the yard but began shovelling away heel and toe, and the wolf himself was obliged to get up on his hind legs and dance tatherjack wallish along with the rest. A good deal of the people got inside and shut the doors, the way the hairy fellow wouldn't pin them in. But Tom kept playing, and the outsiders kept dancing and shouting, and the wolf kept dancing and roaring with the pain his legs were giving him. And all the time he had his eyes on Redhead, who was shut out along with the rest. Wherever Redhead went, the wolf followed, and kept one eye on him and the other on Tom, to see if he would give him leave to eat him. But Tom shook his head, and never stopped the tune, and Redhead never stopped dancing and bawling, and the wolf dancing and roaring, one leg up and the other down, and he ready to drop out of his standing from fair tiresomeness. When the princess seen that there was no fear of any one being kilt, she was so diverted by the stew that Redhead was in, that she gave another great laugh, and well become Tom. Out he cried, "King of Dublin, I have 2 halves of your daughter." "Oh, halves are all," says the king. "Put away that devil of a wolf, and we'll see about it." So Tom put his flute in his pocket, and says he to the baste that was sitting on the carabungo ready to faint, "Walk off to your mountain, my fine fellow, and live like a respectable beast, and if ever I find you within 7 miles of any tie now—" He said no more, but spit in his fist and gave a flourish of his club. It was all the poor devil of a wolf wanted. He put his tail between his legs and took to his pumps without looking at man or mortal, and neither sun, moon, nor stars ever saw sight of him in Dublin again. At dinner every one laughed but the foxy fellow, and sure enough he was laying out how he'd settle poor Tom the next day. "Well, to be sure," says he, "King of Dublin, you are in luck. There's the Danes moddering us to no end. Deuce run to lusk wid 'em, and if any one of us can save him from him, it is this gentleman with the goat skin. There is a flail hanging on a collar beam in hell, and neither Dane nor devil can stand before it." "So," says Tom to the king, "will you let me have the other half of the princess if I bring you the flail?" "No, no," says the princess. "I'd rather never be your wife than to see you in that danger." But Redhead whispered and nudged Tom about how shabby it would look to renege the adventure. So he asked which way he was to go, and Redhead directed him. Well, he travelled and travelled till he came in sight of the walls of hell, and bedad, before he knocked at the gates, he rubbed himself over with the greenish ointment. When he knocked, 100 little imps popped their heads out through the bars and axed him what he wanted. "I want to speak to the big divil of y'all. Open the gate," said Tom. It wasn't long till the gate was thrown open, and the old boy received Tom with bows and scrapes, and axed his business. "My business isn't much," said Tom. "I only came for the loan of that flail that I see hanging on the collar beam for the King of Dublin to give a thrashing to the Danes." "Well," says the other, "the Danes is much better customers to me, but since you walked so far I won't refuse. Hand that flail," says he to a young imp, and he winked the far off eye at the same time. So while some were barring the gates, the young devil climbed up and took down the flail that had the hand staff and the bolteen, both made out of red hot iron. The little vagabond was grinning to think how it would burn the hands of Tom, but the dickens a burn it made on him, no more than if it was a good oak sapling. "Thank ye," says Tom. "Now would you open the gate for a body, and I'll give you no more trouble." "Oh, tramp," says old Nick, "is that the way? It is easier getting inside them gates than getting out again. Take that tool from him, and give him a dose of the oil of stirrup." So one fellow put out his claws to seize on the flail, but Tom gave him such a welt of it on the side of the head that he broke off one of his horns, and made him roar like a devil as he was. Well, they rushed at Tom, but he gave them, little and big, such a thrashing as they didn't forget for a while. At last says the old thief of all, rubbing his elbow, "Let the fool out, and woe to whoever lets him in again, great or small." So out marched Tom, and away with him, without minding the shouting and cursing they kept up at him from the tops of the walls. And when he got home to the big bawn of the palace, there never was such running and racing as to see himself and the flail. When he had his story told, he laid down the flail on the stone steps, and bid no one for their lives to touch it. If the king and queen and princes made much of him before, they made 10 times more of him now. But Redhead, the mean scruff hound, stole over, and thought to catch hold of the flail to make an end of him. His fingers hardly touched it when he let a roar out of him as if heaven and earth were coming together, and kept flinging his arms about and dancing that it was pitiful to look at him. Tom ran at him as soon as he could rise, caught his hands in his own too, and rubbed them this way and that, and the burning pain left them before you could reckon one. Well, the poor fellow, between the pain that was only just gone and the comfort he was in, had the comicalest face that you ever seen. It was such a mixtherum gatherum of laughing and crying. Everybody burst out a laughing. The princess could not stop no more than the rest, and then says Tom, "Now, ma'am, if there were 50 halves of you, I hope you'll give me all of them." Well, the princess looked at her father, and by word she came over to Tom and put her 2 delicate hands into his 2 rough ones, and I wish it was myself in his shoes that day. Tom would not bring the flail into the palace. You may be sure no other body went near it, and when the early risers were passing next morning, they found 2 long clefts in the stone where it was after burning itself and opening downwards, nobody could tell how far. But a messenger came in at noon and said that the Danes were so frightened when they heard of the flail coming into Dublin that they got into their ships and sailed away. Well, I suppose before they were married, Tom got some man like Pat Marra of Tomenine to learn him the principles of politeness, fluxions, gunnery, and fortification, decimal fractions, practice, and the rule of 3 direct. The way he'd be able to keep up a conversation with the royal family. Whether he ever lost his time learning them sciences, I'm not sure, but it's as sure as fate that his mother never saw any more want till the end of her days. End of Section 26. End of Celtic Folk and Fairy Tales, edited by Joseph Jacobs.